It's really nice to be here and to talk about this book, which actually has been out for a few months. My task is to tell you enough about this book that you'll find it interesting and captivating, but not so much that you'll feel that you already know what's in it and that you won't want to go and buy it, which is what allows me to say that if anything that I'm going to say sounds incomplete, incoherent, ill-supported, nonsensical, I can guarantee you that it's all explained very well and thoroughly in the book, and you should take a look at it. But let me start with a little story that's actually not in the book, and it's about this man, Milton Friedman. A couple of weeks ago, I was invited to a panel discussion at the University of Chicago. And I didn't know this, but next year is going to be the 100th anniversary of the birth of Milton Friedman. And on the occasion of that, there's going to be a rescreening of sort of this famous free-to-choose TV series and the book that I guess some of you, but not everybody here is young enough and not to remember. So some of you sort of may remember probably the iconic part of this PBS TV series is when Milton Friedman is explaining the magic of the price system or the magic of the marketplace, and he has a pencil, and he says, isn't it amazing? This pencil says the graphite, I don't know where it comes from. It's probably somewhere in California. The wood might come from Mexico. The machine that was made to cut down the wood could have been done anywhere else. And thousands and thousands of people had to get together somehow to cooperate and put their labor together. And in the end, it would produce the pencil that you're using for a trifling sum. And then the wonderful thing about this was that actually nobody had to coordinate any of this. This was all achieved by the magic of the market system. So this was the famous pencil story, which I actually took it from somebody else. So for some reason, it wasn't made explicit that it wasn't his story. But I've been sort of reflecting about that. And so here is a pencil. Can you guess where it's made? China, as in fact more than 60% of the world's pencils today are made. And I just sort of, you wonder, why is this pencil made in China? China has no innate advantage in making pencils. There's much better sources of graphite in South Korea and Mexico. There's much more plentiful supplies of wood in Indonesia and Brazil. Germany and the United States has much better technology. Yeah, sure, China has a lot of plenty of, cheap workers, but so does Ethiopia and Bangladesh and many other countries as well. So why is it that this pencil is actually made in China? You can tell a lot of stories about this, but any story that would have left the role of the Chinese government and the role of the kind of industrialization policy that China followed in this period, that any story without that role would have been incomplete. After all, it was the Chinese state that started the first pencil factories and trained the first batch of workers and managers. It was the Chinese state that subsidized the production and export of these pencils. It was the Chinese state that, because of its forest management policies, ensured that the wood that the Chinese pencil manufacturers were using was very cheap. And of course, in the last 10 years, it's the Chinese state and the central bank that has been keeping the currency artificially undervalued, so that Chinese exporters get a effectively a huge subsidy by being able to export it. Now, what would Milton Friedman have said about that? He would have said, well, he would have rued. I mean, he would have thought that all this intervention was probably not called for. But it's really hard, and that when you look at the experience of China in the last 30 years or so, it's really hard to avoid the conclusion that the kind of sort of extensive interventions that the Chinese government has employed in order to foster and stimulate industrialization hasn't in fact played a significant role in what is effectively history's most significant poverty reduction program ever over the last 3 decades or so. So clearly China's move towards markets after the late 1970s was very important, but the other side of it was that there was a lot of things that the government was doing to get these new industries off the ground at the same time. So that's sort of my entry to some of the key themes in the book itself, which I state by way of a certain number of paradoxes. These aren't really paradoxes, they're just paradoxes only if you're coming at them from a very sort of conventional standpoint. So one paradox is that really markets seem to work really best when governments aren't weak, but where governments have been strong. The countries where markets seem to have allowed the production of the generation of the greatest amount of wealth are in fact the countries where the size of the public economy, the size of the public sector is actually the largest. And secondly, my China example, I think, very vividly illustrates the greatest benefits of globalization, this expansion of the market system on a global scale, have actually gone to those who have opened up selectively, in fact, haven't quite played it by the rules of the kind of globalization that we've had in the last 2 or 3 decades. In fact, I say that China has played the globalization game by the rules of the Bretton Woods system rather than by the rules of the post-1990 regime in terms of its extensive intervention, its capital controls, its currency interventions, and so forth. I heard the mosquito net, which I think is a very nice metaphor. I heard it first from a Chinese student who was talking and saying about what China's approach to globalization was, and he said that we'd like to open the window, but we don't want to forget placing a mosquito net on the window. So you want the window open so you can get the fresh air, but you want the mosquito net to keep the pests out, or whatever sort of the analogy here is going to be. And thirdly, sort of the paradox, which I'm going to be sort of building up towards, is the idea that globalization, in some sense, the best kind of globalization is some intermediate level of globalization. And I think one of the mistakes we've made is try to push a good thing too far. And many of the ills of globalization, I think, in the last 2 or 3 decades arise from that. Let me not sort of move a little bit back into some of the key ideas that motivate the book. First idea is that there is a fundamental complementarity between markets and non-market institutions of governance. These aren't always public institutions, they aren't state institutions, but they often are. And in fact, the kind of modern markets that are required often require a very large complement of public institutions and public functions typically provided by the state. And so my corollary to Adam Smith's dictum that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, my corollary is that the extent of the market is limited by the scope of workable regulation and governance. So the reason for that is that the kind of markets that modern economies require aren't necessarily self-creating because they require a vast network of institutional, of infrastructural investment. They're not self-regulating because of various problems of asymmetric information and the other kinds of externalities that we're familiar with. And they're not self-stabilizing, of course, as we see today, because of the need for a bevy of monetary and fiscal institutions. And they're not self-legitimizing, because there's no guarantee that the distributional outcomes that markets throw out are going to be consistent with the norms of society. So that's why we have mechanisms of social protection, social insurance, the welfare state, and so forth. And I think the main point here is that basically markets work to the extent that there are these institutions that support them. The second point is that when you look sort of empirically and ask sort of where is the main locus of these institutions today in the world, they're primarily still focused, they primarily are at the level of nation states. So it's really largely the nation states that are providing these functions. I talk in the book a lot about sort of the possibilities of global governance. I'm not a big global governance enthusiast. I think there are good reasons why global governance cannot be pushed too far. With the implication that the kind of democratic deliberation that sustains the carrying out of these public functions will, for the foreseeable future, really remain bound by the nation state. And I'll have a lot to say, well, some to say about the European Union towards the end of my comments. And the third key idea is that, there are differences in the shape that these institutions take across different nation states, and that there are good reasons why these differences exist. And so if you ask sort of what is the appropriate kind of labor market institutions or financial regulatory institutions or fiscal institutions, differences in countries' history, their culture, and also their level of development, their income level, will have implications for what are these desirable forms of institutions. So that these institutional underpinnings that exist at the level of nation states will naturally differ across nation states. So what is the end result of this? I think if you put these three ideas together, none of which is really particularly controversial, I don't think. If you put them all together, you get a conclusion which says that there is a fundamental incompatibility between the ideas of markets that are trying to become global, and yet the supporting institutions that are fundamentally and for actually good reasons still have to remain national. And I trace out the idea and its implications by way of what I call a political trilemma. This is the political trilemma of the world economy. And I'm going to sort of explain this idea through a whirlwind history of the world economy. So I'm going to illustrate what this trilemma says by drawing on sort of key periods, key epochs in world history. And I start with the gold standard, which is the first flourishing of the era of globalization with free capital mobility and largely free trade as well, certainly by the standards of anything that had preceded it. But this was a world economy. The 19th century, the late 19th century, was an economy where we didn't have one world government or we didn't have anything like global governance. It was basically a world divided into different polities, different states or different empires. And the manner in which sort of we reconciled what I call here hyperglobalization or an extreme form of globalization with a divided global polity was what Tom Friedman has called the Golden Straitjacket. The idea was that what the state or what the government could do was really limited to what was required to maintain the rules of the gold standard. And any other domestic, economic, or social objective became subservient to that goal. So basically, you had to maintain your gold parity, you had to maintain free capital mobility. And if that meant that you couldn't do what today we would call counter-cyclical business, a counter-cyclical macroeconomic policy, of which there wasn't really a conception then anyhow, but of course it went with the idea of the gold standard, or if you wanted to spend, sort of have social safety nets and so forth, that those really were not feasible because they would be conflicting with the rules of the gold standard. So what the gold standard model did, it narrowed domestic policy space in various eras in order to minimize the transactions cost in the flow of capital and goods across borders. Now, this system worked very well. In fact, it generated an amount of globalization, certain amount of economic growth and development in the world, but it had one fatal flaw. And it was fatal flaw was that it actually required the domestic policy, the state, essentially be insulated from popular movements, from domestic mobilization, from democratic and participatory politics. Because it meant that any time there was a demand for employment, demand for protection, demand for social insurance, that basically the state and the government be impervious to those demands in order to be able to maintain the rules of the gold standard. So Tom Friedman, once again, I think is a nice way of describing this. It says that when you put on the golden straitjacket, and he's thinking about, by the way, not the 19th century gold standard. He's actually thinking about economies today because he thinks that's what has happened, is that when you put on the golden straitjacket, basically your politics shrinks. Your politics becomes sort of the political choices you end up having is between a Pepsi and a Coke. And all other sort of local flavors get banished because you can't sustain the kind of variety of political demands that is demanded, that the rules of open economic borders requires. And ultimately, of course, we know from the collapse of the gold standard in the interwar period that when Britain in 1931 faced a trade-off between maintaining sufficiently high interest rates so that it could maintain gold parity, no matter what happened to unemployment, versus letting the the parity go so that it could devalue and lower interest rates. Ultimately, when in an era of a newly democratic era, where the worker movement had become unionized, where they had the vote, and where there was something looking like a mass media that was militating against these gold standard policies, ultimately in the interwar period, it was the politics that won, and Great Britain went off the gold standard in 1931, a situation that is actually not that dissimilar from what happened in Argentina with the convertibility law in 2001, 2002. Is Domingo Cavallo here? Who was on the list, but yeah. Okay, and it's actually also something very similar to, I think, the process that Greece is going through today. Now, Keynes, having lived through this experience of the 1930s, was instrumental in building an international regime in the aftermath of the Second World War, which looked very different. Oh, there it is, okay? And that regime we may sort of call the Bretton Woods Compromise. And the Bretton Woods Compromise basically said that sort of Keynes's and many other economists' reading of what had happened in the interwar period is exactly the way that I've presented to you, which was that in modern economies it was impossible to presume that the domestic economy would adjust to whatever external conditions required, and that you had to reverse the priorities and give priority to domestic objectives and let the external conditions adjust. And effectively, the Bretton Woods Compromise was based on that idea, that it's got to be sort of hyper-globalization that's got to be kept at some distance. So the particular rules that were written into the IMF's Articles of Agreement, for example, the acceptance of capital controls was very much part of that. And it's very interesting, in 1945, Keynes said about capital controls, he said, the importance of capital controls in the current system is not as a temporary expedient, it's as a permanent element of the regime, because he viewed that for individual countries to have the room to conduct independent monetary and fiscal policies, permanent capital controls were going to be required to give them those room. And the room was required not just for Keynesian macro policies, the room was required also for the erection in the immediate post-war period of welfare and safety nets and welfare states in the advanced industrial countries. And the room was also utilized for an increasing number of newly independent developing countries for essentially moving away from commodity specialization and developing new industries and promoting industrialization. So the Bretton Woods Compromise essentially opened up the space for domestic government policy at the expense of globalization, so that states were free to follow a combination of Keynesian macro policies, welfare state policies, economic restructuring policies. I mentioned capital flows, but of course, even in the trade regime, there was a significant amount of freedom left for individual governments. Because when you look at what the GATT system was, it was actually by the standards of free trade a joke, because trade liberalization under the GATT was limited only to manufacturers and only to trade amongst the advanced countries. And even within manufacturers, textiles and garments were taken out of the system as soon as they became problematic. So that's sort of the interpretation of the Bretton Woods Compromise. Since about the fall of the Bretton Woods regime and moving into the last couple of eras, I think the problem is that we have been increasingly moving towards back towards hyperglobalization. In the financial sphere, so of course financial globalization. In the trade sphere, it's the replacement of the GATT regime with the WTO, which is much more imperialist in some sense in its aims. And I think the net effect of that has been that on the one hand, because of the lack of adequate regulation, we have had inefficient outcomes, as we see, for example, in the frequency of financial crises, and also because of inadequate governance of trade, we've seen failures of legitimacy, with sort of the WTO essentially being the world's least popular organization. It's from an economist standpoint, it's the most wonderful thing since sliced bread. But if you ask, take vote, sort of look at polling data, it's highly, it's an institution whose legitimacy is among the least. So there's in principle a third, of course, alternative in terms of this trilemma. That third alternative is to say, well, what's so sacred about national sovereignty or the nation state to begin with? So why don't we just why don't we move up politics to the level of global or regional markets? So in some sense, the global governance solution to this trilemma is basically to say, well, let's combine our institutions of legitimizing institutions, our popular institutions, our democratic and accountability politics with the scope of the market. But of course, that means we have to move politics to the global level or to the regional level. And that, in principle, is a third possibility. Of course, that would require significant restraint on national self-determination, and therefore the kind of regulatory, institutional, and policy diversity that we would have in a divided polity world. I'll come back to the global governance in a second, because in a way, what the European Union has been trying to do at the regional level is an incomplete replication, or incomplete path to that. But the trilemma, essentially putting this together, is that basically, we have a choice, that we can only pick two out of these three possible outcomes. And we better make a choice, that we can't really have all these three things simultaneously, and many of the problems that we have essentially arise from our trying to simultaneously push on those three desirables, or at least sort of want to keep all of them while pushing towards the other. Let me illustrate this a little bit in the sort of, 5 minutes or so with the example of the European Union, of course, sort of, particularly the Eurozone, because the crisis, I think, is actually quite relevant, and I think this framework has something to say about that. It's clearly the European Union has been a massive, massive achievement. I'm a great booster of the European Union. I've never been a Eurosceptic because of the impressive amount of institutional creation that this has entailed. The European Parliament, European Commission, European Court of Justice, which is extremely important, the acquis communautaire, well, the last time I looked at 100,000 plus pages. I'm sure it's grown significantly since then. And of course, the European Central Bank and Eurozone itself. But what the crisis has really exposed and revealed is precisely, even with that much institution building at the level of the Eurozone, how incomplete it was to sustain effectively a Eurozone-wide integrated financial and monetary regime. And from my perspective, the Eurozone's misfortune really has been that the financial crisis caught it somewhere in between in this process of institutional integration. And it's not really a criticism of the Eurozone, because the United States itself took more than a century to unify itself institutionally and politically, and it took a very bloody civil war, because after all, the civil war was about what type of institutions are you going to have? Are you going to have the type of institutions that were characterized by the South, or those in the North? And so one shouldn't have necessarily expected the Eurozone to have succeeded, or Europe to have succeeded in building these regional institutions to support a common regional market necessarily very quickly. But the problem, of course, is that this institutional building has been incomplete. How? Well, the easiest way to see how it is simply to compare how things play out in the Eurozone when part of the Eurozone, such as Greece or Ireland, looks like it's experiencing financial difficulty and bankruptcy, compared to what, let's say, would happen if the same was going on in the state government of California or the state government of Florida. Now, from one perspective, it looks very similar in the sense that California shares a common currency just with the rest of the United States, just as Greece and Ireland do in the Eurozone. So just as Greece cannot exit, California and Florida cannot. But there are important differences, because when California, the state of California, becomes insolvent, first of all, Californians are now getting welfare checks from Washington. They're getting unemployment checks from Washington. Secondly, very importantly, just because the state of California is bankrupt doesn't mean that any firm or bank in California with a good, solid balance sheet cannot continue to borrow. Whereas if you're stuck as a firm and a bank in Greece, you're contaminated by the sovereign risk of your own government. Of course, then third, basically banks in California have access to the Federal Reserve and its function of a lender of last resort. This is still a discussion that's today going on, the extent to which the European Central Bank will actually take on a true lender of last resort function. Of course, California interests are represented in Washington, so that if the unemployment rate goes up too high, one option is they can go on strike, but the other is, of course, they can also instruct their representatives and their senator in Washington for federal policies that are going to be more appropriate for California. And of course, Greek workers don't have any similar access to Berlin. And of course, labor mobility is significantly higher within the United States as well. Now, of course, in return for all of this, there is no expectation necessarily that the federal government is going to bail out the California state government. So in fact, and it's a subtle point, that the federal government's no bailout commitment to individual states or promised to individual state government is in fact rendered credible by these above mechanisms, that the citizens of California and Florida are protected directly by the federal government, and therefore the federal government doesn't have to step in and bail out the state of California. So the quid pro quo essentially is that California has given up its sovereignty and has accepted the reach of federal laws and regulations, and in return, California has become part of the governance structure in Washington. Neither of these things is, of course, true in the Eurozone. So with the implication that a crisis within the Eurozone becomes more costly, both in economic and political terms, and which is the crisis that we're still living through. So what does the Trilemma say with respect to the Eurozone? Well, it says, well, presumably you don't want to give up on democratic politics. And what it says is that Eurozone basically faces a very stark choice. It either faces sort of the full regional equivalent of creating a true fiscal union, but I emphasize here that a fiscal union, of course, also implies the regionalization of European politics, because it's going to be totally unsustainable to have regional fiscal policy without democratic accountability and democratic participation to govern those fiscal decisions. So in other words, we as economists may wish that you can just appoint an independent fiscal board, or Berlin, Merkel might wish we're just going to appoint a bunch of Germans to determine fiscal policy in Greece. But that's going to fall apart the moment that the day that the crisis is no longer felt to be urgent. And that's why what we really need to talk as one of the sort of the solutions is not just the fiscal union, but also much greater political federalism. The other alternative, if you cannot stomach this, you say, how in the world are we going to sort of, is Europe going to move in that direction? I think the only alternative is, in fact, the breakup of Eurozone, precisely to give up on regional economic integration. So I think the choice is quite stark: either more political union, which is the only way to get fiscal union going, or less economic union. And I think a lot of the problem is that this has been significantly delayed in Europe, and I think the costs have magnified over time. So what's of course true for Europe, which already has built significant amount of regional institutions, is all the more true for the world, which is that this sort of the national sovereignty isn't going to go away. I think the emerging powers, the new powers in the world economy, like China, India, Brazil, Russia, Turkey, interestingly, these are countries that guard their national sovereignty even more zealously than the old powers of Europe and the United States. So that means that they're really moving into a world where the national sovereignty and the demand for diversity in underlying institutions is going to be very much part of the picture. I think with that in mind, I think the notion that we could be moving towards sort of the global equivalent of some kind of kind of global governance that could underpin truly global markets in goods, services, or finance, I think is unrealistic. And therefore, I end the book with a discussion on sort of what would sort of a lighter regime of global governance look like, and I put emphasis on sort of thinking about global governance not in the sense of less established common rules in the WTO or the IMF or the Financial Stability Forum and so forth, with respect to sort of common capital adequacy standards, common rules with respect to credit rating agencies or derivatives, common rules with respect to the trading regime. Rather than that, we need to sort of focus in a way along the lines of something that's much similar to the Bretton Woods consensus, even if not the specific policies, the practices of Bretton Woods, which is this sort of taking this notion of policy space much more seriously. And I think this sort of policy space would have the advantage of creating some greater room such that countries in different levels of development in different parts of the world economy can pursue some of their domestic objectives in a less hampered way than they have been in the last couple of decades because of the increasing pressure from economic globalization. And I think that could be part of, in the advanced countries, it could be part of recreating the domestic social bargains. In the poor nations, it might be essentially enabling other countries to follow the kinds of strategies that China has followed in terms of relatively free hand with industrial and restructuring policies. Now, my final word is that when I present these ideas, typically the criticism I always get from economists is that this sense of policy space and what I'm suggesting is very dangerous because it leads to a slippery slope. That once you open up this policy space, that countries will inevitably move down the slippery slope of it becoming increasingly more and more protectionist. And I tend to dismiss that counter-argument for a couple of reasons. One is that I think we too often mistake the world economy for a global commons in the same way that the global climate is a global commons. There's a huge difference between the world economy and the global climate in the sense that, if every country follows the kind of economic policies that are actually good for themselves, including moderately open trade and financial policies, you actually have an open world regime. So in order to have an open world economy, reasonably open world economy, you need nothing other than every country doing what's good for itself. Whereas in the case of course, major global problems like climate change, where the global commons problem really bites, you let every country do what they want to do, you end up in hell. Because every country then wants other countries to tax carbon and reduce emissions and so forth. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that democratic politics in each country always functions well so that you get the right policies from the standpoint of economic desirability. But I argue that the way to fix democratic malfunction isn't through some external constraints that come from the IMF or the World Trade Organization or from economists like us, but it's really by sort of fixing those problems by improved deliberation, improved structures at home. And while international rules might have a role to play by raising the importance of certain mechanisms, certain standards for governance like transparency, like accountability, and so forth, I think that's very separate from having international rules towards actually having a common or identical set of rules, whether it's on tax rates or corporate taxes, or whether it's on product standards or on capital, on financial regulation. So this is really a plea for accepting diversity in the world economy, thinking about it as a good thing rather than a bad thing, and also a plea for us to understand that if we do not accept that diversity, in the end we might end up doing globalization more harm than we thought. Okay, so let me just stop here, and let you enjoy your dessert more wholeheartedly.